Marker. And action.
This is Behind the Bells, the show that takes you behind the magic of your favorite Christmas movies and shows. Within the background of every Santa Claus, reindeer, and stocking is a story. Where did it come from? Our Christmas movie expert will unravel all of that and give you the full story. Sit back and enjoy another episode with Robert Nicholas.
Merry Monday, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Bells. I'm your host, Robert Nicholas, and I'll be taking you on another one-horse open sleigh ride into the world of Christmas movies. So far, I've covered a variety of Christmas films from different eras, from the golden age of Hollywood to the more cynical and bombastic times of the 1980s, and even the more recent 2000s of riskier storytelling. There are a ton of movies I want to get to at some point, but today, I wanted to tackle my first short film. Though it would make its debut in movie theaters in 1983, most were probably introduced to it through TV. In a way, you could also call this the first TV special that I covered. It combines two nostalgic elements that almost everyone has a history with: Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol and Mickey Mouse. Despite what may seem like a hard thing to put together, it would end up creating one of the best adaptations of the story, even if it is a condensed version. It wasn't just about taking Mickey and inserting him into the Victorian era. It was also about using the classic characters to tell the same story, keeping the Disney charm without shifting too far away from the darker elements of the lower class that Dickens wanted to highlight. Without becoming too downbeat or too scary for little kids, it has kept the legacy of a lot of people, especially adults, returning to it each year, whether it's getting another showing on ABC or if they're just trying to stream it on Disney+. It also ended up introducing a lot of people to a character that was about to become more popular: Scrooge McDuck, the miser uncle of Donald Duck that was also a treasure hunter. His eventual show, DuckTales, wouldn't be for a few more years, but Scrooge represented a changing of the guards at the Disney Company. I'll go further into what the company was going through during that time, but there was once a time in which people had thought that Disney was on its last legs. It just may have been this short that was an indicator that there was still a lot of life left, even if it took a holiday special to prove it. This is Mickey's Christmas Carol. So keep your hands and arms inside the vehicle at all times. Let's go for a ride. Adaptations of A Christmas Carol are nothing new. Even animated short versions of it had been done several times before. By the late 70s, we'd gotten Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, the Rankin Bass retelling with The Stingiest Man in Town, a Looney Tunes adaptation with Bugs Bunny's Christmas Carol, and probably the best, the Academy Award-winning Richard Williams-directed Christmas Carol. So what was Disney going to bring different to the table? We have to remember that the Disney Company was not in the best place in the early 80s. When Walt Disney passed away in 1966, the animation division had already stopped making shorts in favor of focusing on movies and to save on overhead costs. But without Walt to guide them on storytelling and high standards, it became less of a priority, and the movies being made were just taking longer to produce. Films like The Aristocats, Robin Hood, and The Rescuers would have nearly 3-year gaps, and in order to reduce the budget, would cut corners whenever they could. This would involve a lot of things, such as rotoscope, which was filming live action footage and tracing over it, or recycling old animation. In fact, if you rewatch Robin Hood, you may notice that during the forest dance, nearly all of Maid Marian's movements are the same as Snow White's. That's because it is Snow White's dance. Unlike the latter, Mickey's Christmas Carol would reintroduce people to the Disney magic they hadn't seen in a while. The animation would be slick and smooth, a far cry from the sketchy style that was dominant. The visual storytelling would create an atmospheric blend of calm Christmas majesty and mysterious ghost stories. The voice acting would both highlight new actors for Mickey, Goofy, Scrooge, and bring back an old favorite with Donald. But most importantly, it would be an effective retelling of the Charles Dickens classic. The plot still remains the same. Ebenezer Scrooge is a bitter miser who sees everyone below him as vulnerable and stuck in a position that he might have been in as well had he not become a man, or in this case, a duck, with power. Though his assistant Bob Cratchit is making very little salary to feed and care for his family, he still holds on to an innocence in which he sees the season as a time for grateful blessings. Scrooge could care less for Christmas and only seems focused on keeping as much money as possible. He's visited by the ghost of his partner Jacob Marley, who warns him that if he doesn't change his ways, he'll be damned to walk the earth in chains. 3 ghosts come to show different parts of Ebenezer's life on who he used to be, what his decisions have meant for Bob's family, and finally, what will happen should things remain unchanged. It's safe to say that most people know that Scrooge is going to see what charity and kindness brings, and how simple acts can change things for the better. What people probably didn't know is just how well each Disney character would fit their parts. Mickey is the right guy to play the more innocent and optimistic Bob Cratchit. Donald Duck, though not his typically angry self, plays the nephew Fred well enough that you can see him becoming just as bitter as his uncle. Goofy, in the most unconventional casting as Jacob Marley, brings a more comedic spin to one of the darker moments of the story. Jiminy Cricket, Willie the Giant, and Pete each play their respectable roles as the various ghosts. The most important, however, is Scrooge McDuck as Ebenezer. Along with the story being told multiple times before, the idea of a comedic Ebenezer was also nothing new. What the short would end up doing is introducing a new character to the famous lineup of Mickey Mouse and the gang. Scrooge McDuck, up to the 1980s, was at best a cult character, having mostly appeared in the Carl Barks Donald Duck comic books and 2 Disney shorts. But if you were to have asked a typical family at the time, they would have not known who Scrooge was. They probably would have thought you were talking about Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. Rewatching Mickey's Christmas Carol again for the podcast made me realize that Scrooge McDuck as Ebenezer was a sign of future things to come for Disney. While Scrooge was always in mind to play the leading role, it's possible that the crew could have picked someone else. I'll go into more detail about that later, but the production crew were given free range to select any character that they wanted for each part. Scrooge McDuck just happens to be one of the original quote-unquote gray area characters who wasn't a villain. But he wasn't your typical hero that we had normally seen in Disney fairy tales. He actually had a greedy edge that, if written wrong, would have made him too unlikable to sympathize with. After all, Ebenezer is supposed to be a man who hasn't completely been emptied of his humanity. He's a man who lives in a harsh environment, who's surrounded by people who rely on him. Scrooge McDuck wasn't an angry miser who hated everything and everyone. Scrooge McDuck took the simple joy in his material assets and didn't see a benefit in sharing it. When the ghosts come to show him the error of his ways, we as an audience want to see him change, and his journey felt warranted. We want to see him become grateful to the people around him. We want him to find joy in helping others. Disney wanted to tell a Mickey Mouse story that was simple, but more complex than the older shorts. Of course, this was all being done by the old guard. It wouldn't be another year before Michael Eisner would come in and give the company a necessary jumpstart. Mickey's Christmas Carol would end up being released theatrically in 1983, playing in front of a reissue of The Rescuers. Keep in mind that before VHS and the home video market took off, it was more common for older movies to be given a wide re-release. Also keep in mind that while it is possible that they could have put it in front of a newer movie, Disney only had 3 releases that year. Tex, a teenage drama, Trenchcoat, a mystery comedy, and Something Wicked This Way Comes, an adaptation of the Ray Bradbury novel of the same name. None of those were going for the same family market that Mickey's Christmas Carol was aiming for. The movie would become more of a hit on TV, consistently airing during the holiday season on various TV networks, and of course, the Disney Channel. So how did I first see Mickey's Christmas Carol? Being a child of the 90s, when millennials refer to A Christmas Carol, they usually jump to The Muppet Christmas Carol first. That one too is a great movie that I want to cover at some point. But with Mickey's Christmas Carol, this was the first version of the Charles Dickens story that I was exposed to. I can't put an exact time frame on it, but my earliest memory had to have been when I was either 4 or 5. My family and I were already big Disney fans, so I already had a fair collection of Disney animated movies and Mickey Mouse compilation tapes. If my parents didn't get them for me, then my grandparents on my mom's side were known to pop over with Mickey Mouse cartoon tapes. But rather than buying the tapes from the store, they were known for recording all their movies off the TV screenings and watching those instead. It was a way for them to save money, though I don't think they realized that the TV versions of movies tended to be edited and censored. But since they didn't care for content with heavy language and violence, perhaps this is for the best.
Tonight, your favorite Disney characters invite you to share some wonderful Christmas memories. Join us as Donald plays in the snow. Goofy learns to ski. Mickey decorates his Christmas tree.
Merry Christmas, Bob.
And God blesses everyone.
And for the first time on network television, we bring you Mickey's Christmas Carol.
Thankfully, even as a TV special, Mickey's Christmas Carol remained uncut, and I ended up loving it. When you're 5 years old, you're probably going to love anything with Mickey Mouse in it. What was different was that even at a young age, I was already aware of who Scrooge McDuck was from both the cartoon, DuckTales, and the film from it, DuckTales the movie, Treasure of the Lost Lamp. So instead of initially seeing Ebenezer Scrooge as a standalone character, I saw Scrooge McDuck simply being a darker, more egocentric version of himself. But I wasn't turned off from it, because Mickey's Christmas Carol still remembered the most important element of the Charles Dickens novella, walking the proper balance of both as an eerie ghost story and as a joyful Christmas story. I can recall a lot of adaptations that are either not dark enough to make the scary impact, or come off so bleak that the holidays seem too sweet against the grim atmosphere. Mickey's Christmas Carol feels like a careful walk, sometimes finding some humor in bleak London, occasionally going back to the lighter moments in life to emphasize lost memories, then diving into a sad vision before finishing on a very merry Christmas morning. Watching it for the first time since I was 13, I was surprised by how well Disney could make its own version of A Christmas Carol, even more so when it eventually did make a feature-length movie in 2009 with Jim Carrey. Yes, I was aware that I was essentially watching an extended Mickey Mouse cartoon, but it felt more like a performance from Mickey and the gang. You saw Mickey as Bob Cratchit. You saw Scrooge as Ebenezer. You saw Goofy as Marley. It's as if the characters were well aware that it's been a long time since their last short, and gave a much more modern performance to prove that Disney still had a place beyond the 1980s. So out of the many stories that Mickey Mouse could have starred in, why did they pick A Christmas Carol? How did they decide to take Uncle Scrooge from a cult character to mainstream? Did you know the short almost became feature length? Why did they nix the idea? and of course, why this short would exemplify the sign that Disney as a company was about to return to the public eye. Let's ring out the bells and take a look at the history of Mickey's Christmas Carol. (1953) would mark two occasions. First, the cartoon The Simple Things would be the last theatrically released Mickey Mouse short. From that point on, Mickey would be making most of his appearances on television, primarily on Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. 1953 was also the year that future animation director Burny Mattinson would begin his long career at Disney. Some might wonder why Disney would want to abandon their classic shorts, as even today, they're still acclaimed as some of the greatest cartoons of all time. By the 1950s, the Walt Disney Company and even the film industry was in a different spot than it was when Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was, when that was released in 1937. Walt Disney had initially wanted to take on animation and elevate it further as an art form. As history shows, he would make his mark and then some. But cut to nearly 15 years later, Walt was a new man, no longer the young optimist who was Uncle Walt to his staff. He was a lot less interested in animation since his crew went on strike in 1941, getting the idea that rather than his staff serving him, it was he who was now serving his staff. Plus, being the constantly evolving dreamer, his mind was now focused on his upcoming Disneyland park, having gone as far to start a new company called WED Enterprises, which gave him the control he wanted. The 1950s would still see the release of Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, and Sleeping Beauty, but their high production costs would end up making most of these projects as underperformers. They were still hits in the eyes of the public, but on paper, they were becoming too expensive to justify continuing on a theatrical scale. It wasn't even just Disney facing trouble. Almost every major movie studio in Hollywood was closing up shop on theatrical animation. The majority of the industry was shifting towards television, but this meant a major budget cut in order to make the switch. While a lot of animators, primarily the ones at Disney, didn't want to compromise their quality, it was hard to argue when other artists decided it was better to have half-quality work come out rather than no work at all. In fact, it would only be a few years later when Disney would have competition from then unknown Hanna-Barbera, who would eventually produce the Flintstones, Jetsons, and Scooby-Doo, and also from J. Ward Productions, who would produce Rocky and Bullwinkle. Going back to Burny Mattinson, despite the risk of being laid off with declining work from Disney, he chose to stay on. When he started in 1953, with no opening in animation, he was assigned to the traffic department, which was code for mail delivery. This didn't bother him, as it still gave him a chance to get an understanding on the Disney hierarchy, exactly how one would move up, taking every lunch break opportunity to mix and mingle with other artists to find a crack in the doorway. He got his chance when he was hired to be an in-betweener animator on Lady and the Tramp. Now, what is an in-betweener? Before the days of computer animation, each piece of character animation would have key frames, or points in which the character would be positioned. This could be moving hands up and down, or even taking steps. In order for the key frames to come out looking smooth, in-betweeners would be responsible for creating intermediate frames that go in between each key animation, usually 2 per key frame. When you compile all the keyframe and quote-unquote in-between frames together, you now have a sequence, a live animation. In-betweeners were also the lowest level jobs in Disney animation. It was his ambition to become a full-time animator, but only the original 9 old men were allowed to be animators. Everyone else could only be assistants. When Lady and the Tramp was completed, he was hired by Mark Davis to assist him on Sleeping Beauty. Though he was finally happy to be getting some real work, he came to understand that his personality wouldn't work with Mark. So when production ended, Eric Larson, who was another member of the 9 Old Men, took Burny under his wing. For the next 2 decades, Burny would work with him, assisting on various animation projects, such as The Wonderful World of Color, The Mickey Mouse Club, The Sword and the Stone, Mary Poppins, The Jungle Book, and The Aristocats in 1970. By this time, Walt Disney was gone, and many of the original 9 old men were starting to retire, along with Eric Larson starting a new recruitment program that would bring on many new animators to Disney, including Don Bluth, Tim Burton, Ron Clements, Henry Selick, and Brad Bird. Burny was finally given a promotion to do character animation, getting to do a lot more work on the upcoming Robin Hood. From here, he would move on to do animation for the short Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2 and the movie compilation The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Under encouragement from fellow 9 Old Men member Ollie Johnson, Burny became a storyboard animator for The Rescuers. Burny would end up enjoying storyboarding because this is the closest thing to directing he could get into in animation. To quote Burny, "Storyboards are the closest thing to direction you can get. You're telling cameras where to go, what is happening on screen, where to cut, and thus giving direction and making the blueprint for the film." End quote. He was right. If the storyboarders are going to be the first to give the animated movie its design, that almost makes it the most powerful position. He was getting his first feel into directing animation. He did full story work for The Rescuers and The Fox and the Hound. He was also assigned to storyboard The Black Cauldron, but for the first time, he was facing the difficult dilemma that he was given a project that he didn't want to work on. By this point, it was the early 80s, and Disney was trying to find a way back into the public conscience. The newer movies weren't faring well at the box office, with the only money coming from general re-releases of classics. This was not great news for a studio that used to be known for pushing the boundaries of its technology and storytelling. The Black Cauldron was meant to be the big comeback, as fantasy stories and games had been popular at the time. Though it would take too long to go into detail on that movie's plagued history, Burny was having a lot of trouble making a movie story based off of a 5-book series. Though he debated about staying on, his wife Sylvia, who was also a Disney animator, encouraged him to finally start his own project. He decided to take a back seat on the Black Cauldron in order to shift focus on something he's always wanted to do for a while, a brand new Mickey Mouse cartoon. We're going to take a short break, but we'll go into more detail on the new idea in a moment.
And now back to the show with our Christmas movie expert, Robert Nicholas.
In March of 1983, now that he was off the Black Cauldron, Burny started to work on an animated adaptation of A Christmas Carol starring Mickey Mouse. Why was that classic picked as the story for Mickey? First, Burny had always wanted to do a Christmas movie of some sort, in which the Disney company surprisingly has not made a lot of content around that. But also, there had already been a recorded version of A Christmas Carol from Disney. And it also had Scrooge McDuck playing Ebenezer. And was even already voiced by Alan Young. To give a little background, in 1974, actor Alan Young had taken a long break from acting after his TV show Mr. Ed had ended in 1966. He had a friend who was currently running Disneyland Records, a separate company from Disney who was responsible for everything Disney on musical media. They had previously attempted a record of Disney characters singing carols that didn't sell well. They had some nicely drawn artwork of Disney characters in Dickinson-style costumes that they wanted to reuse. When Alan was asked if he knew a lot about Charles Dickens, he revealed that he had actually belonged to a Dickinson Society in Canada. It was then he was asked to write and star in an audio musical record of A Christmas Carol with Disney characters, in which he said yes. He wrote the script with another writer, Alan Dinehart, and voiced several characters, including Mickey Mouse, Tiny Tim, Uncle Scrooge, and Merlin, who was playing the ghost of Christmas Past in this version.
It seemed I'd been abed only a moment when the clock started to strike the hour. I heard a ghostly, evil wind. Then appeared in the dim light before me a strange figure dressed in a pointed cap with moons and stars on it. He wore a dress-like cloak that fell well below his knees, clearly last year's fashion. Are you the spirit I've been expecting? Who are you? I pray thee, ask me not who I am, rather ask me what I am. Okay, what am you? I am Merlin, the magician. Look, Merlin, I'm in no mood for card tricks. I am the ghost of Christmas past. It is my intention to perform a wondrous feat of magic. I will whisk you into your past when you are but a youth, in a faraway time and in a faraway place. How will I get there? I am Merlin, and with my magical powers I will fly you. Come, take my hand. And with that we were through the window and flying over the darkened city.
It was released in time for the 1974 Christmas season, titled An Adaptation of Dickens' Christmas Carol, in which it sold well. Burny was aware of the album and thought a lot of it could translate well as an animated short. Burny wrote a 2-paragraph pitch for Mickey's Christmas Carol, along with the 1974 album, and sent it up to then Disney CEO Ron Miller, who also happened to be the son-in-law of Walt Disney. The next day, he was called into Ron's office. Burny seated himself in the chair in front of his desk. Immediately, Ron grumbled and went off on a 5-minute rant, demanding to know why such a dumb idea was being sent to him and why his time should be wasted on something like this. This baffled Burny, as he knew he had a great idea. He was ready to defend his concept. He was going into the battle of his life, knowing well he was going to risk his job. But before he could say anything, he saw Ron giggling a little bit before it erupted into laughter. It all turned out to be a prank. With Burny standing speechless, taking in the empty feeling that previously held a lot of pressure, Ron composed himself and said, "I think it's a great idea. I want you to do it." He then told Burny to go back downstairs and start on it now. As instructed, Burny went back down and set himself up in an office with bare walls. He started to storyboard his first original project. Though he could have easily set up the entire story, he decided to work on the beginning of it, using the Carl Barks painting, Season to be Jolly, as the guiding point for the tone. It features a Dickinson-style setting, with Uncle Scrooge walking into a dark city corner while carrying a large sack with a dollar bill sign with a grumpy face, away from Donald Duck and his nephews in the background, embracing the Christmas elements such as the falling snow, a wreath on a light post, and a large Christmas tree next to a crowded church. There's some dark humor in the picture with a sad-looking Santa as he sees Scrooge getting away from the holiday environment. While not all these elements would end up in the Mickey's Christmas Carol, the clever balance of joy and dark would end up becoming the tone for the new special. About 2 weeks later, Ron came downstairs to see what Burny had done so far. He absolutely loved what he came up with and gave the official green light on the project. He told Burny that he was now allowed to assemble a team of animators to bring the story to life. He also told him that they needed the majority of the special to be completely storyboarded and the voiceover recording to be done by May so that they can start animating it by then. This only gave him a month and a half to accomplish all of that. Burny was excited to finally have his first full project that he was going to direct and produce. But he also had a lot of pressure on him. He needed to recreate the Disney look while bringing a new voice. He needed to make sure that the Fab Five would all fit in. He even needed to find a new actor to play Mickey Mouse. So, how did all that go? We'll go into that into the next episode, which will also talk about how they got an actor to come out of retirement, how they selected certain characters, and how it even almost became a feature-length movie. Be on the watch for part 2 of the story of Mickey's Christmas Carol.
Thank you for joining us on this sleigh ride into the magical world of Christmas movies. Check us out for weekly rides into your favorite Christmas classics and their histories. Be sure to give us a positive review on iTunes if you like what you heard. And don't forget to follow us on social media on Facebook and Instagram for updates and special news. Consider subscribing on Patreon in order to help keep the show going and to gain access to some special gifts not available to the public. Merry Monday to all, and to all a good night. See you next week.
Cut. Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.